He had everything a man could buy: jets that hummed like distant generators, a house with more rooms than most neighborhoods had houses, doctors whose names filled hospital corridors with deference. Yet 8 years of every possible treatment, every experimental device, every specialist flown in and consulted, had not given him the one thing he wanted most: the sound of his son's voice. The mansion was a museum of silence, a silence so thick it pressed against the curtains, pooled on the marble floors, and made the clocks feel like intruders. It was in that silence that a new woman's footsteps would crack something open. If this story found you, subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Oliver Hart moved through his life like a man trying to atone with currency. He filled rooms with comfort and noise, soft classical on hidden speakers, rotating art installations, a fleet of cars that purred at the touch of an app. But he could not buy back the ordinary music of family dinners, the rough laugh of his little boy, the scrap of a paper airplane cutting the air. Catherine had been the center of sound, her absence carved hollows in the house that no amount of renovation could fill. Her death had been sudden, a collapse in the kitchen that the paramedics could not reverse. The shock of that night had been the first thing to steal speech, and then, quietly, the second blow came. Shah stopped responding to sound. Doctors had called it irreversible. There were tests, high-resolution imaging, electrical studies, long lists of Latin diagnoses that Oliver paraded before any consultant who would listen. He built a wing of the house into a therapy center. Sound engineers lived on the estate for months, coaxing frequencies through mannequins, inventing hearing aids that looked like jewelry. Money bought options. It could not buy the one small, human thing no machine could manufacture: attention, uninterrupted and careful, aimed at the one little face that turned away. Shah, short, quick, a name that fit an almost too small body, moved in rituals. He woke with the sun hitting the blinds in a pale band across his quilt. He roamed the house under his father's voice orders, though he never heard them, moving between rooms by memory. The playroom with toys arranged by color, the study with a fireplace gaslit for mood, the conservatory where a wind chime had been installed more for aesthetic than for sound. He learned sign, and tutors taught him to read lips and sense vibrations. He touched the grandfather clock with reverence more fitting to a relic than to a thing that could have been rude and ordinary and simply tick. When Victoria Dia answered the ad for cleaning staff, she brought with her a different kind of urgency. Newark had taught her economy and grit. She had left behind an apartment with a window that looked over a street where children learned to play with what the world discarded. Her grandmother's bills were a quiet stack that kept her awake. Prescriptions, heat, calls from a pharmacy that had long since stopped making polite promises. She had a history of tending, a neighbor with arthritic hands, a cousin Daniel, who had been her secret small miracle to care for when doctors said there was nothing to do. She took the job not for the marble and chandeliers, not for the quiet corridors, but because the paycheck would mean a warm winter for her grandmother and the chance to pay off a past debt that had followed Victoria like a shadow. The Hart household had rules that felt less like policy and more like ritual. Shoes removed at the door, hours when cleaners could be present, only authorized staff in certain wings. Mrs. Patterson, head of staff, had the kind of face that could make policy into moral law. She gave Victoria a brisk orientation: where to wipe, how to fold the sheets, which rooms were for family only. "Keep your head down," Mrs. Patterson said in a voice that implied the alternative had been tested and found wanting. "Eyes forward. Don't touch the child unless he reaches for you. The Hart family is private. But rules and rooms are thin things when a small face looks at you in a way that asks for someone to see the quiet suffering." Victoria noticed details that had been smoothed away by wealth and routine. She noticed how Shah habitually pressed his small hand to his ear and then drew back, as if he were pushing at something that wanted to be left untouched. She saw the way his face tightened at odd moments, a micro-ache that never had a voice. She learned to sit where the sunlight pooled in the playroom and fold little paper things. She made a paper bird one afternoon after watching Shah bend over his trains with a concentration that suggested he was searching for something. She learned a trick of patience, that a small crafted object can be an offering more eloquent than a million quiet apologies. The bird was cut clumsily, wings uneven, but he took it. He held it like a sacred thing, and then, with the small, shy smile of a child who had found a secret, he tucked it into the pocket of his sweater. That tiny private exchange became a language between them. She folded paper. He accepted it. They both acknowledged an unspoken treaty. At night, when the house felt like a sealed museum display, Victoria sat on the back steps with her own memories. She would press her palm to the cool banister and remember Daniel's laugh when he finally could sing again after an ear infection as a child. How a simple visit to the clinic had removed a hardened band that had stuck like a small, unyielding stone. She did not know if what Daniel had suffered was anything like Shah's condition. She knew only this: sometimes what seems permanent has roots in something small and missed. But she also knew the stakes. This house could swallow a mistake. Mrs. Patterson's eyes could slice a reputation. People could be sent away. The Hart household was wrapped in contracts and codes. A misstep could be a dismissal or worse, a denouncement in a world that eats the poor woman who steps beyond the line. Victoria prayed. Her prayers were not grandiose. They were simple. Lord, give me courage to do right. If she failed, let her failure be the kind that had nothing to hide. As weeks passed, small rituals deepened. Victoria learned to make Shah laugh without sound. She traced patterns on the toy drum until his fingernails danced on the rim. She invented signs, folding a hand to the heart for friend, tapping two fingers together for play, and taught them in the hush of a house that judged noise. She tied a red ribbon to the doorknob of Shah's bedroom and tapped it twice whenever she wanted to remind him of where things were. Her methods were not medical. They were tenderifications, small acts that made a child feel attended to. There were warnings. Mrs. Patterson noticed that Victoria lingered too long by the playroom and pulled her aside. "Don't get involved," she said. "Not your place." The words froze like frost on a windowpane. But the warnings did not stop the ache of seeing a child flinch. The motif of the hand to the ear became a slow drumbeat in the house. At first it was a quirk, easily shrugged off as a tic. Then it became more regular, a touch at the edge of sleep, a hand grasping air as if trying to catch a sound that had slipped away. Once, Shah woke in the night and began to walk the halls, eyes blank with searching. Victoria found him in the dim conservatory, palms flat on his cheeks, tears making small tracks down his face. He did not cry with sound. His sobs were little hiccups, but the grief was unmistakable. Victoria sat with him, let him lean against her shoulder, and felt the density of the silence pressing at her chest. She thought of her grandmother's bills and of Daniel's face when he first heard the radio after the obstruction was cleared. She thought of prayer as a rope into something larger than herself. Then, in a day that would later be described in 1,000 retellings around the Hart estate, Shah's pain turned urgent. It came like a storm that burst without warning. He fell to the floor suddenly in the breakfast room, hands clawing at his ears, body folding inward as though trying to compress pain smaller so it might fit. His face went pale. A soundless cry shook his shoulders. The house filled with motion as staff rushed, some with expressions carefully blank, others with hurried efficiency. Someone called for Dr. Matthews. Someone else held the boy's shoulder. Oliver was away, in a meeting about an acquisition, his phone buzzing with the kind of crises that money usually soothed. Victoria watched the scene with a feeling she had never felt in any of her jobs, a focused animal fear that made her breath too quick. She had been trained in cleaning, in following orders. She had not been trained for this, But the primacy of human contact, the careful tending she'd learned in Newark, pushed her forward. She moved toward Shah not as a heroine, but as someone with a hand steady enough to try. Mrs. Patterson's voice tried to restrain her. "Stand back, Victoria!" But something taut inside her snapped. This was not theatre. This was a boy on the concrete. What she did next was not a well-planned procedure. It was a trembling, desperate act of love. She had seen enough of the body to know where fear hides, and had hands that could remember the small, practiced motions she used, tying shoelaces, threading needles, making the difference between thread and fabric. She thought of Daniel and the hardened thing that had once been lodged in his ear. She prayed a brief, broken prayer under her breath, not for outcomes, but for steady hands. "Lord, steady my hands, please." She moved close, and in the quick, private seconds before anyone could stop her, she worked with an improvised tool. No instruments of surgery, only a small, blunt instrument fashioned from what she had at hand, and felt, by touch more than sight, the resistance of something that didn't belong. It yielded with a soft, reluctant give, like a small stone dislodging from a boot. There was a sound, small, a first thread of a stitch being pulled, and then another, and then a noise like a clock finally agreeing to its job. Shah froze. He put his hand away and looked around as if the world had been repainted in unaccustomed color. A tiny, tentative gasp slipped from him, a sound that was not language yet, but the first evidence of sense. The grandfather clock in the hallway published its tick like someone announcing an arrival. He blinked. Victoria's heart pounded so noisily she thought she might scream. Instead, she covered her mouth with her hand to stop herself. Then he heard it, a low, familiar voice calling from the study. "Oliver." It wasn't a call to dinner, not a shout or a name. It was the chemical signature of comfort, the inflection that had been there his whole life, but had not reached him. He turned his head. The world assembled itself into layers he didn't know existed. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of a leather sofa, the little wheeze of the central air, things he had never known he could know. And then, like a bell folded into a warm palm and suddenly released, a voice he had been waiting for in the dark said, "Shah? Dad?" The word tumbled out, small and raw and inaccurate, but with meaning. It was a sound that belonged in kitchens and scraped knees and a million ordinary moments that money could not repurchase. The syllable was not perfect. The timing was off by the years that had gone unrecorded in his ears, but it was a bridge rebuilt in one breath. The study door burst open. Oliver had been racing back from his meeting, a briefcase in one hand and a practiced look of control on his face. He froze when he heard the sound that would not have been possible in recent memory. There was a beat, an impossible suspended second, in which he registered the boy, the open mouth forming a syllable, the woman kneeling beside him with a look that mixed relief and pure terror. His first words were not words of gratitude. He had been trained by the world to react to disruptions in control with swift containment. "What did you do?" he demanded, voice a hard thing. The house seemed to listen to the sharpness. Eyes turned. Staff grouped like fish around a churning hook. Mrs. Patterson straightened as if to declare a point of protocol. Victoria rose slowly. Her hands were stained with the residue of what she had removed, and her expression was a ledger of every possible consequence. She could be fired. She could be sued. She could be accused of playing doctor. She could be arrested. She had done what mothers do when they see a child suffer. Act first, tally the cost later. The staff moved too quickly. Security appeared, with the efficiency of wealth defending itself. Someone had called for restraint. Someone had called for the police. Oliver's eyes narrowed, taking in details like a man calculating loss. He thought, "We have a system. We pay for order. A cleaner cannot override the protocols of medicine." He could not yet open the chest of feeling that thrummed beneath his ribs, the sudden, breathtaking hope, the release of guilt folded tight as paper. "What did you do?" Oliver repeated, but his voice had shifted. Under the edge of accusation there was something else, a note his staff did not recognize, a trembling you would only hear when a man is relearning how to be a father. Security took Victoria away gently, as if she were fragile rather than criminal. She went without resistance because she knew the truth of her action. She would rather be judged than leave the boy suffering. She came away with the sticky residue of a miracle and the knowledge that miracles often arrive with a bill that is paid in small indignities. The Hart household erupted into movement. Dr. Matthews arrived, short-sleeved and efficient. He examined Shah with the clinical curiosity of a man who had spent his life cataloguing the body's failures. He did not condemn Victoria. The record would not show his moral verdict in a single line. There were questions, procedures to be followed. The sound lodged itself in the room like a witness. Later, at the hospital wing Oliver had built, there was an image in a file that reoriented everything. A scan from 2 years prior had recorded something small and dark in Shah's ear. The note beside it, clinical, terse, referenced the finding and suggested follow-up. The follow-up had not happened in a way that the file would later show. It was a banal thing, a missed appointment, a misfiled note, a bureaucratic slip, and yet it sat there like a splinter under the skin of the family's story. No malicious intent was evident in the neat handwriting, only an implication of an oversight that, once seen, burned with the heat of preventable sorrow. Oliver read the document twice, his vision doubled by the slow unspooling of comprehension. His life had been invested in control. He had contracted the best. He had delegated his grief into experts and machines. The file was a ledger showing human lapse. It was not a tale of villains, so much as a record of how systems can fray at the margins where human attention is assumed but not given. He did not collapse into melodrama. He folded to his knees at the edge of the hospital bed, shaking with a remorse that had nothing to do with suits or lawsuits. His shoulders heaved. He had been a fortress of transactions, arranging consultants and paying labs, while the simple intimacy of looking, truly looking, had been missing. In the presence of a woman who had no qualifications to perform miracles, he admitted what the house had whispered for years. He had been absent. "I'm sorry," he said, and the 2 words cut against the dull armor he had worn. He knelt there, small and humbled, in a way he had never been in boardrooms or on news rounds. He apologized to Shah with no grand gestures, just the flat and pure currency of a father's regret. He apologized to Victoria in the same moment because he could see what had driven her, not rebellion, but compassion. He saw the cost of her action and knew, in that unadorned second, that nothing he had could replace what she had given. There were practicalities, investigations, statements, security reports. The household staff argued about protocol and loyalty. Mrs. Patterson's jaw clenched in the way of someone who had always believed that order was protection. Dr. Matthews, tested and surprised by the finding in the file, offered a measured statement that did not exculpate the hospital system, but acknowledged error. Humans, records, sometimes they do not align. No one painted simple villains in ink. The truth was messier. The discovery was a fault line, and the aftershocks rearranged how the family moved through the house. In the weeks that followed, Oliver's world rearranged itself. He ordered the staff to reinstate Victoria's position and then to give her more than a salary, a fund to pay for her grandmother's medicine, an offer of housing if she wanted it, a letter of recommendation that would not be necessary but was his way of making amends. He did not make speeches about how he had been wrong. He made quiet acts, small but weighty. He taught himself how to sit on the floor and play, how to not always have a calendar in his hand. He learned how to be present not as a man who purchases care, but as a man who gives it. Victoria, for her part, returned to the house with the carefulness of someone who had seen the full glare of consequences. She had her moments of doubt. Had she done the right thing? Were the hands that had steady nerve now ruined by scandal? But she also had the steadying knowledge that the boy she had tended now looked at her with the kind of gratitude that did not need to be spoken. She had been given an unusual kind of vindication, the soft lift of a child's hand, the way he tucked a paper bird into his pocket and then made sure Victoria saw. Shah's first weeks back in the world of sound were a series of discoveries. The clock became a companion, its tick like punctuation for the day. Time now had a voice. The kitchens hummed, cutlery sang. He made small, triumphant noises that his tutors recorded as progress. He said the word "Dad" again and again, practicing like a musician rehearsing a measure. He learned to whistle slowly, absurdly, as though sound were a strange toy he was testing for the first time. Tears came and went, sometimes joy, sometimes frustration at the flood of stimuli. There were nights when he covered his ears because the world had become too large. The family learned to modulate the house, to allow silence and sound to exist in a new, gentle balance. Oliver's repentance was not performative. He did not simply pour resources into fixing the record. He sat with the staff and asked questions about how the house ran, about how a missed notation could translate into years of absence. He listened, which was perhaps the hardest thing for a man used to being the one who spoke and decided. He listened to Mrs. Patterson's defences, to Dr. Matthews' explanation of paperwork, to Victoria's simple account of what she had felt. He discovered, in the small humiliation of listening, the architecture of a promise he had not known he could make, to be better. Victoria was cautious about accepting too much. She had always been practical. The compensation she received was far more than she had expected, but she took it as a means to an end, a way to close the accounts that had haunted her family. Yet the thing she treasured most was not money. It was an apology that did not want to be televised, a handshake that was not a purchase. It was the quiet understanding that her act had been recognized for what it was. Not reckless delinquency, but a human reach to relieve suffering. The house changed. Where the silence had been a shroud, a new sort of attention filled the rooms. It was not loud. It was not showy. It was the kind of listening that looks someone in the eye and keeps asking, "Are you okay?" It had been a long road for Oliver to accept that his ability to spend could not substitute for the attention and presence that heal in parts no medicine can reach. He began to take longer walks with Shah, walking the grounds while the boy practiced saying new words. He began to sit and watch sunlight on the curtains and feel gratitude as a muscle he could exercise. There were moments of public fallout, of course, rumors, staff meetings, questions asked in the polite fury of those who felt betrayed by protocol. But there was also a quiet restoration. Dr. Matthews, confronted with the file, amended the chart and called Oliver with the frankness of a man who had not known because he had not looked. He did not become a villain. No one in the story fit comfortably into a moral outline with black and white strokes. The point, if there was one apart from the immediate ache of mercy, was that systems are made of people, and people are sometimes forgetful, sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes simply human. Oliver made gestures that matched his new interior architecture. He started a foundation in Catherine's name that funded listening clinics in under-resourced neighborhoods, places where attention was scarce and where children like Daniel and Shah might be more easily missed. He did it not because such gestures could undo what had happened, but because making a public contribution felt like a way to honor the small, human labor that had saved his child. He elevated the work of cleaning staff, health aides, and caregivers in the company's benefits program, ensuring that those who tended to others would not be financially invisible within institutions that usually undervalued such labor. Shah, in time, learned to make jokes about the house's quiet past. He enjoyed the way sounds now painted the rooms, how the kettle boiled with a proud whistle as if to announce its own existence. He sometimes sat with Victoria and taught her the words he most wanted her to hear again. "Thank you, friend, stay." Those words were small and steady, like bricks in a path. Victoria kept folding paper birds. She left one on Oliver's desk one morning, neat and bright, and he kept it, tucked in a drawer, where he would find it on nights when the house felt too wide and his chest felt hollow. She did not stay out of a sense of triumph. She stayed because what had begun with a paper bird and a hand on an ear had grown into a life that mattered to more people than she could have imagined when she boarded the bus to the Hart estate on a chilly morning. There were quieter lessons that lingered beyond the headlines the story might have garnered. Attention, as the family and staff would come to realize, is a kind of medicine. It cures in ways that statistics cannot measure. It cannot reverse death, nor can it guarantee repair where harm has been done, but it can shift outcomes by the small yet inexorable force of someone looking and acting because they are moved. Victoria's courage was not saintly, it was messy and frightened and weighted with the cost she knew she might pay. She paid parts of that price in the weeks of suspicion and the quick, cold legalities that followed. She was questioned, not because she had done something wrong in the moral sense, but because the world requires narratives to reconcile itself in its own tidy ways. She answered with the truth she had held all along. She had acted because a child suffered, and because she could not, in good conscience, stand by. Oliver learned humility, not as a speech but as a practice. He practiced the act of saying, "I was wrong," to people whose faces had been in the shadows of the house for years. He apologized to the servers who had brought him coffee and to the nurses who had charted his family's life. He learned to be present for the rituals that had once embarrassed him. Bedtime stories, the hand-washing routine, the morning scramble for socks. He placed the inherited pride of billionaire stewardship into a new posture, the posture of an attentive steward. There were also quiet, tender stitches that the public never saw. The way Shah learned the cadence of his mother's laugh in recordings Oliver kept. The evenings when Oliver would read aloud from a book of short stories, his voice uncertain and then finding itself. The times when Victoria sat at the edge of the playroom and made paper animals while Shah taught her the sound of a bird's wing. They learned together the oddness of being both wealthy and newly vulnerable. The story's moral was not a tidy maxim. It was not meant to be a recipe. It resisted being sold as a shortcut to miracles. It was a chain of small causes and effects, human generosity intersecting with institutional failure and with one woman's risky, praying hands. It was about how life, in its peculiar stubbornness, sometimes returns sound to those who have been living in silence, and how that return can come through people who are often least expected to deliver it. In the months that followed, Oliver and Victoria met in a way that was not transactional. They shared coffee. Victoria refused most of the large gestures of payment, accepting instead what she needed to keep her grandmother steady. Oliver listened. Really listened, as she described the neighborhoods she had come from, the smell of fried dough at the corner stand, the sound of her grandmother's radio on rain-filled nights. He told her about Catherine in small images, the way she loved rough bread, the habit she had of humming when she folded laundry. They spoke of small, human things, and in speaking they reconfigured what family could mean in a house that had once been a mausoleum of wealth. Shah, now learning the world of sound, sometimes asked the simplest and most devastating questions. Why did no one hear me? His query was not accusatory at first. It was a child's attempt to make order. Oliver answered as best he could. He told Shah about machines and tests and doctors who did their jobs. He told him about grown-ups who thought paperwork could stand in for looking. He promised, without over-promising, to be a man who would listen better. He told Shah he was proud of him, several times a day, careful to let the words reach him as a father's bread. the household continued to function inevitably as a complicated organism. The staff adjusted their routines. Mrs. Patterson softened her rhetoric a touch, though she kept her standards. Dr. Matthews began to advocate for better internal review processes at his hospital, not because he wanted to be a public figure, but because he had seen the subtle, preventable failure documented on the scan and knew such oversights happened too easily. No easy villain emerged. People were human, fallible, sometimes heroic, sometimes lazy, often tired. Victoria never sought spotlight. She declined interviews, asked that nothing about her family's poverty be sensationalized. The headlines for a week or two tried to gild the story with dramatic words. Maid or miracle, they asked, as if the truth could be captured in an adverb. The family did not lean into that. They let the narrative, which was messy and real, breathe. There were prayers, small, private and unshowy. Oliver, in the quiet evenings, thanked what he felt was bigger than him, but did not render it as a simple transactional promise of outcomes. He whispered to the memory of Catherine, to the small intelligence of his child. Victoria, too, said her prayers. "Thank you, Lord," she would murmur, "for steady hands and for courage." Her words were personal, not doctrinal. They were the kind of prayer you say when you have nothing else to offer but a beating heart. Time, as it does, stitched new patterns into the family's days. There were ordinary, miraculous domesticities, Shah singing badly off-key to a pop song, and Oliver laughing without noticing what his suit cost. Victoria teaching Shah how to fold a paper bird, and then being handed back 12 of them the next morning, each one creased in ways that made them new. The house learned to be loud in patches and quiet in others. The silence that had been thickened by grief did not vanish. It softened into something that made space for sound to arrive when it needed to. The most revealing scene came not in a public statement, nor in a press photograph, but in a small afternoon, months later. The house had invited a few of the staff and friends to tea. Nothing elaborate. A tray of biscuits and a pot of tea made the old-fashioned way. Oliver sat with Shah and Victoria on the rear terrace where sunlight pooled around their knees. Shah had a toy car in his hand and a paper bird tucked into his shirt. He looked at Victoria and then at his father. He reached out, small fingers trembling like the first time someone takes a violin bow, and touched Oliver's cheek. The gesture was not scripted. It was the simplest possible thing, a child returning an affection to the man who had been absent and present in equal measures. Oliver lowered his head to meet that small hand and whispered, "I'm sorry." He had said the words before, but now they were tempered by months of listening and altered by a humility he wore like a new coat. He turned to Victoria and offered the apology she had not asked for, but that she deserved. She nodded and said simply, "It's all right." The simplicity of the exchange, no performance, no televised absolution, felt like the most honest kind of redemption. If there is a lesson to be drawn, it is not that money is useless or that systems are intrinsically wicked. The lesson is smaller and more urgent. Attention matters. Watching, listening, refusing to be lulled by the comfortable assumption that someone else will look, those are the acts that often change the course of a life. Victoria's choice was a risky, human reach for a small boy's suffering. It cost her something and gave others a chance to repair. People asked Victoria later with soft curiosity if she regretted what she had done. She would not couch her choice in conscience alone. She said she feared the consequences, that she had prayed, that the thing she removed was small and ugly and not hers to keep as a trophy. But she also said this, "If I had the chance to go back and do nothing, I couldn't. I'd rather face the consequences than live with a child's silence because I was too afraid." The Hart house did not become a utopia. The legal niceties that followed were handled with the sort of carefulness that wealth provides. Statements, settlements, the rewrite of procedures so that a missed note in a file would not translate into a lost voice. Yet the deeper repair was less bureaucratic. It was in how people moved through their days, with a bit more care, a little more humility, a steadier attention to the small human signals that can be lost in the roar of efficiency. On quiet evenings, when the sun slid down the tall windows, Oliver would sometimes sit by the grandfather clock and listen. Shah would be nearby, building small things with paper and tape, his hands steady now, his laughter bright and uneven and real. Victoria would sit with a book in her lap and a cup of tea cooling in her hand. They would share the silence, not a heavy, suffocating silence, but the gentle kind that follows after a tide has pulled back and the pieces left on the sand look different, brighter, arranged. This story does not offer a universal instruction, and it refuses the cheap comfort of a moral that fits neatly on a postage stamp. It offers a tableau of human choices, a father who had the means yet lacked attention, a child who lived in a world of missing sounds, a woman who risked the thin protection of her job to do a human thing, and a system that, unnoticed, sometimes fails those it is built to protect. It offers, too, the notion that care, uncelebrated and often unpaid, can alter the course of lives in ways that matter just as much as any headline. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs hope, and tell us below where you're watching from.